In the early 1970s, construction workers in Australia launched a wave of militant direct action, winning better pay and conditions, then began pursuing social goals for better housing for working class and Aboriginal people, for women's and LGBT rights, and in defence of the natural environment. In just a few years, they held up billions of dollars of harmful development. This is working class history. Firstly, just a quick note that this podcast is only made possible by support from our listeners on Patreon. You too can join us and get benefits like exclusive early access to episodes, as well as bonus episodes, discounted books and merch, and more. Learn more and sign up at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. The late 1960s were a time of intense social upheaval and class struggle around the world. From anti-colonial movements in Africa and Asia, to mass strikes in France, to urban revolts in the US, to riots in Japan, and to the hot autumn in Italy. Workers, women, people of colour, colonised and indigenous peoples, and LGBT plus people were all fighting to advance their collective self-interests. One place where many of these struggles coincided was Australia, primarily in New South Wales, where construction workers decided to organise themselves and fight, not just for better wages and working conditions, but for a different type of society, one based not purely on profit, but on human needs, where we live in harmony with the earth. The tool they devised to do this was the green ban, essentially a refusal to undertake work which was environmentally or socially destructive. On a personal level, I first became interested in possibilities of social change as a kid because of the environment, because of the sheer ridiculousness of the fact that we're destroying the planet we live on, and on which all human life depends, just to make profits, which most of us don't even benefit from. And later in life, having taken part in a number of struggles and read about many hundreds of others, I came to the belief that the most effective way for social change to occur is by the collective self-organisation and direct action of working class people ourselves. So the story of the green bans in Australia has always particularly inspired me. Basically, it's a perfect intersection of these two things. This story centres on one union in particular, the Builders Labourers Federation, BLF, and I was very happy to be able to speak with Dave Kerin, who was a builders labourer and scaffolder and member of the union at the time.
So yeah, but I hit the building industry around about the end of 1970. I was in and out as a boy of the building industry, as most people were. It was always what we'd call today casual work back then, until the union sort of bought some control over it. I'd been involved in the anti-war movement through the 60s because my brother was in the army, and we all had to register for national service over here. And then if your marble dropped with your number on it, your birth date on it, then you were in the army. So a lot of us, we had to find out what the hell was going on in Vietnam. It became important that we did that. And the more we found out, the more we realised we were on the wrong side. And that was hard. It split a lot of families, just like it did in America and other countries right down the middle. And having been involved in that, I saw the BLF in the anti-war movement. I saw them at the rallies. I saw how well organised they were. I saw the level of self-education that their rank and file had. They were impressive. And so in the end, around about the end of 1970, I found myself beginning to work in construction, and that sent me smack into the green bans.
I was also extremely pleased to be able to speak with Dr Meredith Burgmann, who was a highly active supporter of the green bans and also became the unofficial archivist of the BLF.
When the Builders Labourers went out of existence, they had about 24 hours to clear out their office, and I was very distressed about their records just disappearing. So I offered to have them stored in my very tiny front room, my sitting room. So for some years I had 50 or 60 boxes of union records in my sitting room. Some of the other records were stored in the basement of the pub that the Builders Labourers used to drink in, the Sussex Hotel. And when my thesis supervisor, when I was doing my PhD, suggested that I switch from my the topic it was a foreign affairs topic about Indonesia. He said, really, you should be looking at the builders labourers. You've got all their archives. And he was absolutely right. So I then lived with the builders labourers as my thesis project for the next 7 years. And also, of course, we wrote the book about them.
Meredith and her sister Verity Burgmann's book is called Green Bands, Red Union, The Saving of a City. It is a really fantastic and important read, so we'll pop links to get it in the show notes. The Green Bands were the high point of the development of construction workers' organisation in Australia, which really began over a decade beforehand in the New South Wales branch.
The point about the builders labourers was that in the 1950s and 60s, the union had a placid, right-wing, reasonably corrupt leadership. A rank-and-file group under the leadership of Jack Mundy had fought very hard to gain the leadership of the union. Jack had joined the Communist Party of Australia in the late 1950s, and a lot of the rank-and-filers were also in the Communist Party. Although some were also in the left of the Labor Party. It was a fairly amiable sort of unity ticket that they always ran. By 1968, Jack had become the secretary of the union, and the very long period it had taken to win the leadership of the union meant that he had thought a lot about democratic structures and how to make unions more democratic. So a number of the processes that he brought in when he became leader were the first one, of course, that caused a huge amount of angst amongst other trade union leaders was limited tenure of office. The builders labourers brought in a rule that you could only do 2 terms in office, that'd be 2 3-year terms, and then you had to go back and work on the tools.
One of their first things was a raft of measures, policies, not only external policies around the workplace and solidarity with other workers here and overseas, but internal policies around democracy, policies designed to limit bureaucracy and maintain democratic participation and involvement by workers. So things like limited tenure of office, where you never did more than 2 terms in the job, and then you went back either into construction or you'd retired or some other job.
Another one was that when the industry was on strike, they didn't get paid when the officials didn't get paid. Another was that officials' pay was tied to the builders' labourers' wage. They also believed very strongly that their migrant workers, and there were a lot of migrant workers in the industry at the time, that they should be very much a part of the union decision making. So they always had translators on stage during mass meetings.
Shop stewards or delegates monthly meetings, where hundreds of shop stewards would come in, making sure that all of the language groups were fully involved. So mass meetings would often be a very long affair because all of the translations would happen as the meeting proceeded. So that because you had an industry back then that was sort of, well, in Victoria it was around 85%. I think it was in the 70% in New South Wales were direct migrant workers. So not the sons and daughters of migrants like today, or the grandsons and daughters, but the actual direct migrant workers. And the most amazing people coming with the most amazing array of experiences from countries all over the world. And not much good if they'd go to a meeting and they didn't understand what was going on there. So the union took a very strong position on that, and the participation and engagement was a sight to behold. I mean, it was revolutionary.
The migrant workers were from all over, but there were large numbers in particular from Italy, Greece and the former Yugoslavia, mainly Croatia and Serbia.
And we saw employers often on the job create situations where there was tension between groups. So one of the things that the BLF did was to eradicate those differences, make sure that translations were always done at the meetings, make sure that when you produced material, it was in the other languages, even if it was only the primary languages, because it was pretty expensive. And to make sure that these newer Australians understood that this was their country, that this was their workplace, and that they had the democratic right equal with everyone else to decide what happened there. That sense of, in our workplaces and in our union, we are working people, and that unites us. Everything else is poetry, and it's beautiful. So we just, regardless of where we come from, because everybody in Australia, apart from our First Nations, our Indigenous brothers and sisters, we're all boat people. And, it was a really important thing that the racism on the job that some employers, as a means to control workers on the job, would instigate, that we opposed that and we provided the alternative to it. And you saw that, workers who had English as a second language, you saw them begin to step up, become delegates, become organisers over time, over the years.
And they also tried to take as many of the decisions that they made back to a general meeting rather than having the decisions made just at the executive level. So they'd fought very hard to get a democratic union, and late 1960s into the early 70s, that was really appreciated by the membership. So you had a union that was very much supported by its membership. They started to look at other areas that they could get involved with. They became very interested in Aboriginal land rights. They started talking about the rights of women and the rights for women to work in the industry, which was at the time a very controversial policy. But they ended up having women officials, women were on the executive of the union.
There were a succession of struggles to improve the pay and conditions of builders' labourers over a number of years, with mass participation and direction by rank-and-file workers themselves. During this time, the workers' collective self-confidence and self-organisation grew. By the onset of the 1970s, the union had expanded significantly, more than doubled in size, and there was a huge development boom, particularly in New South Wales and its capital, Sydney, where money was flowing in and high-rise buildings were being constructed in large numbers for the first time.
The problem with development in Sydney at that time was that there was a very corrupt state government, the Robert Askin government, very pro-developer. It was a Tory government.
Robert Askin and his government were of the Australian Liberal Party, which is the main centre-right Conservative party, which may be a bit confusing to some right-wingers in the US, but a central aspect of the ideology of liberalism is free market economics, and it's these classical liberal economic ideas which the party name references.
There was also no legislation at all that could protect buildings or really even parkland. There was no heritage legislation, there was no environment legislation. We had to wait until the late 70s, when a Labor government was elected in the state, for that legislation to be put in place. And of course, it was very much as a result of the Green Band activity. Another problem for Sydney in particular, as opposed to Melbourne, was that a lot of hot money was coming in from overseas. It was to do with the valuation of the Australian dollar. A lot of money was coming in from America wanting to invest. There was also the fact that the building industry was changing. Prefabrication meant that much higher buildings could be built. So you went from the highest buildings in Sydney being about 12 stories to up to 30 35 stories just in that early 1970s period. So there was a classic overdevelopment boom. There was a lot of money to be made, and so traditional working class areas in the inner city like the Rocks, Woolloomooloo, Glebe were going to be just razed to the ground, and high-rise executive suites or offices were going to be built. The low-level 100-year-old houses that were in those very desirable inner city areas just weren't making enough money for landlords, so they had to be cleared away, and high-rise had to occur, according to the developers.
High-rise buildings and new construction technologies caused major changes in the building industry. In Australia, like much of the rest of the world, construction workers were typically divided into multiple different unions by trade. So most skilled construction workers, like carpenters and joiners and so on, were members of the Building Workers Industrial Union, BWIU, while the BLF organised labourers, inaccurately dubbed as, quote, unskilled workers on worse paying conditions. And the skilled workers' unions defended their privileged position with respect to the, quote, unskilled labourers. Skyscrapers made of concrete and glass, though, don't really need carpenters or joiners, but they do need large numbers of labourers. And the construction boom also needed large numbers of labourers to work in demolition, destroying existing buildings so that new ones could be put in their place. These changes were giving additional potential industrial power to builders' labourers, and they seized the opportunity. They organised strikes, and in addition to that, they took advantage of features of the production process to maximise their potential impact. So, for example, they realised that the concrete pouring was a crucial moment, because if it was interrupted for too long, all of the concrete would be useless. So labourers would stop the pour, make demands on the employer, who was then under intense pressure to agree them right away, because if they waited too long, the poured concrete would be no good, and it would also all have to be removed and started all over again. Tactics like this understandably enraged the employers, who typically rely on workers and their unions playing nice to some extent. In addition to these lightning stoppages, there were some major industry-wide disputes.
Yes, there were two big industry strikes in the early 1970s. There was the accident pay strike, and of course it was a very, very dangerous industry at that time. There were no real regulations about, for instance, safety, about the dogmen going up on the hook. So you'd have high-rise office buildings being built with the dogmen just hanging onto the hook as the crane swung them up, 30 or 40 stories into the air. And there were a lot of deaths from falls. So the accident pay strike was very important. The second really important industry strike was the margins strike, and it was to change the difference between tradesmen's pay and builders' labourers' pay. And basically, I looked at it when I was doing my thesis. The margin between the journeyman and the master in the building industry, that margin hadn't really changed for about 500 years. So when the builders' labourers won that decision and the margin was very much narrowed, it did cause real problems with the tradesmen's union, who of course felt that their skills were not being properly recognised. But it's also interesting that the builders' labourers' skills were being upgraded simply because of the nature of the industry. As the industry changed, the actual labourers were being asked to do more and more skilled labour as the buildings grew taller and taller.
The margin strike was a really key event in the development of the militancy and organisation of builders' labourers. The New South Wales BLF walked out in May 1970 demanding higher pay for the, quote, unskilled builders' labourers compared with skilled tradesmen. They were being paid about 75% of the trades rate. When the strike began, the Employers Association, the Master Builders Association, MBA, they refused to budge, while the Tradesmen's Union, the BWIU, didn't support them, while its leader, another Communist Party member called Pat Clancy, advised them to return to work. But builders' labourers in mass meetings voted to continue the strike, so the NBA tried to break it by organising mass scabbing. That's using non-union members and members of other unions to work on its sites instead of the striking workers. There were too many small building sites scattered over a huge area for workers to be able to organise flying pickets, mobile groups of strikers who would picket different sites. So a number of rank-and-file workers got together and decided to organise what they called vigilante squads.
That if scabs did our work, the union members would go out and destroy that work, physically destroy it. Not destroy the scabs, but take their work apart.
After working hours, these squads would enter building sites and then systematically demolish anything built by scabs. Some sites were also occupied by the workers.
There was an occupation of the by the builders' labourers of a building in North Sydney, and the builders' labourers always had this saying, "Never eat the boss's lunch." And what that meant was, do not be duchessed by the employers. Do not allow yourself to, be taken off to lunch and then agree to some thing that wasn't what the workers wanted. So this statement, never eat the boss's lunch, was really quite well known around the industry. And one of the old builders' labourers, rank and filers, a guy called Mick Curtin, actually in this occupation of the site in North Sydney, occupied one of the offices and found a lunch on the desk. And so he rang up the boss and said, "Hi, I'm really enjoying eating your lunch." So from then on, we had a slogan which was, "Never eat the boss's lunch unless you occupy the site and find it on his desk." And there were often joyous occasions where builders' labourers really enjoyed the fact that they were no longer under the heel of the boss, that they were seen to be fighting back.
After 5 weeks, the employers had to concede defeat, and at the end of the dispute, builders' labourers' pay in New South Wales was up to 99% of the skilled workers' rate. This then got passed on to builders' labourers across the whole country. In addition to acting on things like pay and safety, BLF members tried to take more control of the job on building sites, as well as reshape the construction industry in more radical ways.
Yeah, so when I came in, there was basically a 4-year cycle, boom and bust. And when I started to come in, because it was a process, the industry was booming. There was a lot of work around, and for a young bloke, that was great. But it was always a problem, especially for the older men who had children, and they relied on the building industry for their work, their full-time, permanent type work. Boom and bust was a real problem for them, and the union always had a view that they had a democratic right to be able to nominate people when there was unemployment, to be able to nominate people who should take that work. And that involved a number of things, one of which was, especially when people elect a delegate, a shop steward, or somebody has been an organiser for the union and then steps back into the ranks, employers were going to blacklist those people. There was just no two ways about it. So workers had to have some capacity, some power to be able to insist and say, this person will work and they will take that job. And that was a battle, I suppose, for all unions. We've all faced that. But in New South Wales particularly, and in Victoria it was done as well, but done a little differently, organisationally speaking. There were instances where the employers had to ring the union office if they wanted to fill a position, union hall hire. And in the BLF, when I came in, there was the beginnings of the development of a policy called permanency, 52 weeks work a year for builders' labourers, as a way to offset the casualised nature of the industry, the insecure nature of the industry. So every worker under that policy, which was never really achieved, but the struggles to get it involved workers' control. Where workers took on the job of saying, well, you need to fill a position on the job. Well, this is the person who's going to fill that position. They've got the ticket to do the work. They're available. They're fit. They're ready. They start work tomorrow. And even to the extent in New South Wales where workers were worked in, was the idea of a work-in instead of a walk-off, a walk-out, a work-in. And the worker would be brought in, work alongside everybody else, and the employer ultimately was forced to accept that the democratic right of that worker to work, and that just because they had been, or especially because they had been a spokesperson on another job, either as a delegate or at some stage they might have been an organiser for the union, that was something that was a badge of honour. It was something that we respected, and they had to be able to work, especially those people. And of course, the logic being that if you couldn't protect your spokespeople, you'd have no union. So, that idea of union hall hire / permanency was part of a raft of policies like the green bans that involved workers' control. The idea of workers having an equal say with the employer as to what happened on the job, what happened in our lives generally.
This was a general background to the conception of the green bans in New South Wales. A construction boom, lots of destructive development, and a well-organised, confident and militant mass of builders' labourers, with a union leadership of rank-and-file labourers who are committed to workers democratically controlling their own struggles, and the idea of workers' control. That idea sounds really obvious, but it's actually really revolutionary, that we as workers should have a say in what we do and how we do it at work. Around this time, Meredith started to get involved with the builders' labourers.
In the early 1970s, I was a postgraduate student living in the inner city of Sydney. I was already heavily involved with left activity. I was a member of the Labor Party. I had been very involved with the anti-apartheid movement and the beginnings of the Aboriginal rights movement, and of course I was a feminist. I had known the leadership of the builders' labourers, Jack Mundy, Joe Owens and Bob Pringle. I knew them quite well through anti-Vietnam activity, especially the anti-apartheid campaign in 1971, which the racially selected all-white South African Springbok team had come to Australia, and there had been huge demonstrations against them all around Australia. I was one of the co-conveners of the anti-apartheid movement in Australia, and so had come into contact with the BLF leadership. Bob Pringle, in fact, got arrested and charged with trying to cut down the goalposts the day before the big Sydney match. So I knew the leadership and some of the other officials pretty well. But what really got me involved was when Glebe, where I was living and where I am still living, my much beloved Glebe, there was a plan to put two huge great distributors right through the middle of Glebe. It would have been divided into three little islands, really. It would have destroyed Glebe. And that was when I got very involved, and I remain involved well. I still organise the reunions for the old builders' labourers 50 years later.
The first green ban in New South Wales was organised in 1970 in defence of an area called Kelly's Bush.
A green ban, which is always acknowledged as the first of the famous 1970s green bans, was Kelly's Bush. Kelly's Bush was the last remaining bit of natural bushland on the Parramatta River, which is part of Sydney Harbour, and a bunch of really middle-class women had been fighting to save it for some time. They had approached their local Conservative Member of Parliament, who was no use. They had written to the Tory government, which of course was no use. They had appealed to the developer, which was even less use. And then they wrote to a number of unions, and the only union that replied was the Builders Labourers. And the Builders Labourers sent their president, Bob Pringle, out to talk to the women and to inspect Kelly's bush. And he comes back, and it's noted in the minutes that Bob Pringle reported on Kelly Bush, as it was called. They always got names wrong in the minutes. And it was agreed by the executive that they would put a black ban on the area until the developer agreed to keep the natural bushland. And of course, the bans were always called black bans. In fact, right through until quite late, I think it's about 1973 that they start being called green bans. Jack has the bright idea to call them green bans because it was agreed in pub conversations that black bans had a connotation of being a bad thing, and that the Aboriginal allies really objected to that. So that's why they became known as green bans.
Just to clarify here, British colonists referred to Aboriginal Australians as black. And as in 1970s Britain, where activists of colour labelled black by the white establishment developed the identity of political blackness, which we discuss in our episodes 33 and 34, many Aboriginal Australians self-identified as black at the same time.
And so that was the first green ban, and it wasn't really terribly portentous, except, of course, that the developer then tries to go ahead with the building work, and the builders, labourers and the residents physically defend the site and eventually win the green ban. I always make the distinction about the green bans in Sydney, especially as opposed to later what are called green bans, is that most of the green bans in Sydney were physically defended, and often at the expense of residents and rank and file builders, labourers and the leadership being arrested for the defence of the green ban. So that's the first green ban in Sydney. And as I say, it doesn't seem very portentous, but of course, within a few months, other areas which had problem with development also started approaching the builders, labourers for help. And there was a huge amount of development that was problematic at that time, particularly in the inner city areas, because that's where the sort of what we'd now call trendy student types, academics, were moving into the inner city and wanting them to become lovely places to live, just at the same time as the developers were seeing the chance to make a lot of money by pulling down their historic old houses and putting up high-rise. So most of the nascent resident action groups really arose in the inner city suburbs of Sydney.
In Melbourne, Victoria, around the same time, there was another green ban. Although rather than being voted on by workers in a mass meeting, it was imposed by the local union leadership, which reflects the different approaches to leadership held by BLF officials in New South Wales and Victoria, which we'll go into more detail about later.
Well, simultaneous with Kelly's Bush, because there's always a bit of a debate about which come first, was the what became known as the Norman Lindsay Gallagher Park here in Victoria, in Melbourne. So it was a strip of parkland that went for a long way, covering a couple of different suburbs of Melbourne, that used to be part of an old rail circle. When the rail land was shut down, the park was retained. And in a suburb called Carlton in Melbourne, the kids from the housing commission flats, the public sector flats, used to go and play in that parkland. It was the only area they had, because there was nothing. The flats never had a yard to play in. So one of the BLF members lived in those flats, and Scotty's tissue company wanted to build a factory there. Carlton now is a very different part of Melbourne. It's got higher paid workers live there now. But back then it was there were a lot of industrial working class people lived there. So he took this issue along to the union, spoke to the secretary and the union executive. The secretary, Norm Gallagher, went down and investigated and ran into the boss, and the boss's son assaulted him, and he defended himself, and he did 14 days jail over putting a green ban, although it was still called a black ban back then, on the development of that site. In other words, it was and that was around 1970-71. So it was definitely the very same sort of thing that was achieved at Kelly's Bush in Sydney.
After Kelly's Bush, environmental and social bans by builders labourers exploded, and also sparked a huge growth of local residents' campaigning groups who the BLF would work with.
Wherever possible, those most affected by a decision should be the ones who make it. And really, when I look back at the green bans, I see that principle at work. A resident action group would set up. Invariably, there'd be anywhere between 200 and 500 people involved. They'd approach the union. The union would investigate if there was real public support for the resident action group and its aims and objectives. Well, then the union believed that its first responsibility as a collective was to the people, not the developers, etc., who were opposed to the interests of the resident action groups and the people who lived in the areas affected.
Then, in New South Wales, any proposed bans were put to a mass meeting of builders labourers to be voted on.
What that meant was that when a green ban was placed in New South Wales especially, you had preceding it a lot of involvement and engagement by the members.
In many ways, these bans could be considered very surprising, because they were essentially construction workers deciding collectively to deny themselves potential work and pay. So you can contrast that with many unions today, for example the GMB union in Britain supporting the Trident nuclear weapons program, or the AFL-CIO union confederation in the US supporting new oil pipelines like Keystone XL. Undoubtedly, the fact that the boom meant that there was still lots of work to go around played a significant factor in this, but the bans were still contrary to the workers' immediate, narrow economic self-interest.
The interesting thing about the bans was that us activists really didn't have to try to convince the rank and file builders labourers of the reason to put a ban on. We would run the public campaign, glebe shouldn't be destroyed, or save the rocks, or working class people should be allowed to live in Woolloomooloo. Those sorts of arguments were put at a fairly general level. The interesting thing was that it was the leadership of the union that used to talk to the labourers about why particular bans should be supported. That was quite good in a way, because it meant that it wasn't, middle-class students telling rank-and-file builders labourers that they should give up perfectly good jobs in order to support our lifestyle. It was really about the leadership fighting out the situation in the pubs and clubs of Sydney. The arguments in the pubs were really very interesting and often got to be quite detailed. There were some bands that were more popular than others. I can still remember there was to be a ban on a swimming pool in the eastern suburbs. It was a harbour swimming pool in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. That's the posh area of Sydney. And a number of rank and filers were saying, why should we do that for the knobs out in the eastern suburbs? Shouldn't we be concentrating on working class areas of Sydney? The builders labourers had a policy that every ban that they put on had to be requested and supported by the local community and had to be passed by a general meeting of builders labourers. And their general meetings were often quite big. Sometimes there were 1,000 or a couple of thousand members at their general meetings, and they would debate and vote on each particular ban. So that was very important because it meant that the leadership kept the membership with them on these, really quite radical policies.
In addition to bans in defence of the natural environment, numerous bans were also put on development which would have harmed local working class communities.
One of the ones that I found most exciting, and indeed the organiser who led this and did all the work, was a green ban on, was a bloke named, Brian Boyd. And the green ban concerned the Victoria Market, the Queen Victoria Market in Melbourne, which is still there, but only just. And the fight to retain it is still going on now. Every 10 years or so, it would arc up again, and the blue would be on again, and it is on again. Harder to fight with neoliberal capitalism and neoliberal organisational structure in our unions. But Brian and the leadership here in Victoria put that ban on the Victoria Market, thank goodness. It occurred because, Norm Gallagher, actually, the secretary of the union, when he started work as a boy at 14, he worked at the Vic Market, loading and unloading all the vegetable trucks and so forth. So there was that sort of link there, as often is the case with green bans. You'll find there's personal and family connections that then become community connections, which then become connections to the union. And so the Queen Victoria Market, the Vic Market as we call it, that is such an important part of Melbourne. Like everybody who comes to Melbourne goes to the Vic Market. If people come from other states even to go to the football, they'll make sure that before they go to the footy in the Arvo in the afternoon, they'll go to Vic Market and have a bratwurst and a cuppa. And so the stallholders approached the union, and the union went down, took it to executive, took it to the branch meeting, the monthly branch meeting, and there were rallies held, and workers went down there to make it clear that the market was not going to be demolished to replace it with yet more office space. That this was a vital part of Melbourne. It provided affordable week's shopping for your food, really good fresh fruit and veg, all your dry foods as well, and your clothes, everything, because it's a massive area. And so that was an amazing thing to watch, because what you learnt from that was that when the union reached out to the people reached back. And even in my history as a boy, when I left home, the place where I first moved in, it didn't have a shower or a bath. It had a wash sink, but so once a week I'd go to the city baths, because they did actually have baths, big hot baths. And they also had a pool where you could do your laps before work if your job allowed it. That was a green ban, because the people who used the pool approached the union. Some of the finest architecture in Melbourne, like world class, world standard. This beautiful bank on the corner of Collins and Queen Street in Melbourne. If you're ever in Melbourne, go and have a look at it. Only there because the union stepped in and placed a green ban on it. And space after space after space saved because of workers saying, this isn't right. We're not just pick up and carry animals. We're human beings. We're not going to treat the communities that we live in this way. So, that you want to do, that's not going to happen. But the important thing about the green bans is this. We always had an alternative plan in place. So it was never just saying no. It was saying yes to a whole bunch of other things. So if you look at Queen Victoria Market, a lot of the good things that happened at the market, the development, the changes, the renovations, were part of an alternative plan that the people in the unions put forward. And that became important later in terms of the development of strategies to deal with climate emergency and capitalist collapse.
The Queen Victoria Market ban, like many others, was not just an all-or-nothing outright ban on any development whatsoever. Sometimes a ban was placed on demolition and construction work in order to make demands on developers and local authorities. Sometimes these were around safety, like improving the fire safety of proposed buildings, Sometimes they were around renovating historic buildings instead of destroying them, and other times concessions like decent housing for working class people was demanded alongside what was included in the original plan. In the next clip, Dave uses the acronym CBD. This means Central Business District, and is generally equivalent to what people normally mean by downtown in the US.
Yeah, well, if you look at the Queen Victoria Market, the Vic Market, it was the Melbourne City Council, which is a major council, like a very, very, relatively speaking, a rich council, covering the CBD and sort of like some of the surrounding suburbs of the CBD in Melbourne. They were the ones who own the land and wanted to sell it and redevelop it. So alternative plans were put forward to renovate the market, to make it even better, because it had been under attack and parts of it had been closed down over decades and decades. And eventually, because the union said, well, the plan that you want to go ahead with is not going to happen, but we will go ahead with this plan, a people's plan, really only gave them one option, unless they wanted to take us on. And back then, that was no mean feat to take on the building industry unions, because by then the BLF was receiving support from the other unions with the ban. And then if they came out and attacked too vigorously, well, we'd just come out of a general strike in 1969 where a union leader had been jailed for refusing to provide the union's books. And, the union movement was strong. So did a council, even if it was the Melbourne City Council, did it really want to take on a class war? And, well, they didn't. And so the ban and the alternative plan held.
That's it for part 1 of this double episode. In part 2 we talk more about different bans, like the one on the Sydney Opera House, as well as in defence of Aboriginal housing, the union's support for women in the construction industry, and how the bans were eventually broken. We've also made a bonus episode where we speak in more detail with Dave about his experiences, and about his activism today. You can listen to both of these right now by supporting us on Patreon. Support from you, our listeners, is the only way we can afford to devote as much time as we do to this podcast. In return for your support, you get early access to content, as well as exclusive bonus content, discounted books and merch, and more. Learn more and sign up at patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. You can also learn more about the BLF in Meredith and her sister Verity's book, Green Band's Red Union, which is a really brilliant read, so we will pop a link to that in the show notes as well. And if you like books, we should probably mention that WCH have written our first book. Working Class History, Everyday Acts of Resistance and Rebellion is a compendium of hundreds of On This Day in History anniversaries, replete with photos, extensive references and further reading, and a foreword from Noam Chomsky. We've also produced some merch commemorating the BLF. You can get all this in our online store at shop.workingclasshistory.com, link in the show notes. And for podcast listeners, you can get a 10% discount off your next order using the code WCHPodcast, all one word. Intro music to this part was Green Band's Forever by Mick Fowler and a jazz band called Green Band, and we're going to end part 1 with an extract of a song City of Green by former Builders labourer Dennis Kevins, performed by Kate Fagan, both courtesy of unionsong.com. Huge thanks to all of our existing Patreon supporters for enabling us to make this episode, and thanks to you for listening. Catch you next time.
In a mighty tide of human pride, we surged through Sydney's streets, and the mark of green on the concrete keen was a king tide full and sweet. Our names are known nor gold on stone, but still our hearts were high to overturn the lies that burn the life from you or I. I marched out front, I took the dump, on me they tipped the can. I saw the heroes point and say, do you call it a man? But when the coppers buckled me and slammed the paddy van, I saw the heroes stop and think, perhaps I was a man. Perhaps I was a man. And now, my friends, my hair is grey and I am growing young. For in the sky the stars will play where once smoke curtains hung. I see the oceans shine with fish, the rivers glint with brim, and there won't be any beaches where the kiddies cannot swim. I built a city of green, the city of my dreams. Ah, my city of green, the best you've ever seen. For still and all we all must dream, far better it is to try to build a city all of green than to let your dreaming die. So, my friends, if you have a dream, do not let it die. And then when you are dead and gone, you'll be alive as I.